Thank you, everyone, for joining me week after week for these live internet studies. My name is Arvin Lyman Hanavi, and this is another study on eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. Let's jump back in where we left off last week. You look on my screen, you'll see we've got the topic index pulled up that I created for these classes. We're now on topic 5. So we struck through topic 4, Book of Daniel, prophecies near and far. Go back and listen to the last few weeks' studies. If you missed that, we looked through Daniel's chapter 2 and 7, where we looked at these overview of the Gentile nations who were directly affecting Israel and her time and what should we say, her relationship with God. It wasn't looking too bright because of the exiles, particularly Babylon's exile that sacked the city and the temple and carted the people off. And yet, when we turn to Daniel chapter 9, which we're going to do tonight, we're going to see another view of this panoramic, if I can say that right, aspect of God dealing with people on this large scale. So let's look at this. Tonight's topic begins, I'm not going to finish this in 1 week, and yet I don't want to drag it out. And yet it's a key topic when it comes to end-time prophecies. The book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel is the name of tonight's topic, and this will go on through tonight, this week, next week, and probably another week. So at least 3 weeks I'm anticipating that this will be stretched out. I'll try not to drag it out farther than that. So 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, possibly. So, Book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. Remember, this is a study on the Book of Revelation, and we're working our way towards the Book of Revelation. And what we're doing is we're filling in all of the background information that I believe is necessary to have a proper appreciation and a better understanding of the Book of Revelation. You don't really have to study all these topics, but my strong recommendation is that you do. Otherwise, you're going to get kind of a superficial understanding of the Book of Revelation. You're going to have more questions than you can probably anticipate. So before I jump into this topic, let me just introduce the challenge in front of us. The topic is very, very profound, and yet it's very simple at the same time. It's the topic that we're going to look at tonight covers a scant 4 verses, Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and 27. 4 verses, that's it. And yet the topic actually is also detailed in other parts of the book of Daniel, which then carry over into other prophecies in the Bible, which then get picked up by Yeshua in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, which we're going to turn to after this, right, in a few weeks down the road. You can see on my screen there, topic 6 and topic 7, which then gets pulled into Paul's writings in the books of the Thessalonian chapters, and then finally gets pulled into the book of Revelation itself. So Daniel's prophecy that starts here in chapter 9, it's already been kind of examined in chapter 2 and chapter 7, the events, as it were, but now God's dream that he gives to Daniel in chapter 9 begins to get a little bit more detail filled in, right? So remember, Daniel chapter 2 was the statue that Nebuchadnezzar's dream represented. That was kind of a really zoom out view of these end time events seen through the lens of world powers, beasts, as we might call them. But they weren't called beasts in Daniel chapter 2. They were metals in the statue. And the Messiah figure shows up as a rock that's cut without hands, and it strikes the statue at the feet. That was Daniel chapter 2. We'll in fact, let me just do this. Did I bring with me? I did. I'll show you a little graphic on the screen here in a moment. That'll be a kind of an overview of what I'm getting at. Daniel chapter 7 gives the same panoramic perspective of these end time events that will take place from dealing with these kingdoms on earth, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then following. And yet it's seen through the lens of these animals, these beasts. And we talked about that last week, how these beasts in Daniel chapter 7 prep us for understanding, a better understanding of the beast in the book of Revelation. But because we're now in Daniel chapter 9, God gives Daniel another dream. And again, this dream is very short, it's terse, but it's compact. I mean, it's just packed with goodies. And yet at the same time, we have now some more details that Daniel's going to talk about as some more in Daniel chapter 10 and 11 and 12 and finish out the rest of his book. So what we skipped over, if you're listening, we went from 2 to 7 and then we skipped 8 and then we jumped straight into 9. And what we missed in chapter 8 was a lot of history about the power shift from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, and then from the Medes and Persians to Greece coming on the scene. You can read about that. Most of you are probably familiar with that, right? The ram and the shaggy goat, and Alexander the Great, and Antiochus, if you want to say his name that way. So what we are learning is that in Daniel there's this type and shadow character known as Antiochus, I want to say his name that way. Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, is one of history's more famous types and shadow of another man who's going to come on the scene, who's known as the Antichrist. So the book of Daniel is where we're going to get a lot of that detail filled in for us. And chapter 9 that we're going to be looking at tonight is going to be no exception. So if there's anything that you walk away with when you're reading through these and doing these studies with me, there are lots of resources you can do online. They're going to go through all more details. This is not a deep dive into the book of Daniel chapter 9. I will do my best to make this as simple as possible, yet remain profound. But one thing that has helped me make sense of it, keeping on the simple side of things without getting too complex and getting caught up in all of the debates between when does the vision start, what's the time frame, what's the decree that we're going to be reading about, who are the prince, who's the Messiah, who's the one to come, how do we understand the word weeks in the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Greek, etc., the English. There's a lot of details that we could camp out for weeks and months on, and many Bible teachers have done that. I don't want to do that. I want to keep it simple, but at the same time, there are some goals to the study. So let me just tell you a few of my goals right up front. One of the main goals, and I'll just bring up this chart that I've used in the past, is to convey this idea to you of prophetic telescoping. The idea that you can see in the picture, they got this prophet standing over on the left side of the screen holding his staff there. And he's looking at two mountain peaks in front of him. And the first smaller mountain peak is called the near fulfillment, and the larger mountain peak to the far right of the screen is the far fulfillment. And between those two, there's a time gap. And what I firmly believe in Daniel 9 is a great example of what we're going to see this. What I firmly believe is that the Bible will often present a prophetic truth to the prophet, or the person writing down the vision or the dream or whatever words that God's giving him. And that prophetic truth will oftentimes have what's called a near fulfillment, near to the prophet, and then it'll have a far fulfillment, far from the prophet. So the near and far represents the time frame from the prophet who's writing the vision down. Oftentimes, the near fulfillment is a partial fulfillment, and often it's done in what we might call shadow. When we talk about type and shadow, it's a kind of a symbolic version of the prophecy itself. It often doesn't represent the fullness of what the prophecy contains as far as details and execution and whatnot, historical fulfillment. But it nevertheless represents part of the prophecy. So it is fulfillment. It's just typically partial, and it's near, usually to the prophet. Not always, but typically right around the corner, like within a few years or maybe within a generation, etc. And then there's often this time gap that goes by that the prophet may or may not be aware of because of the kind of the optical illusion created by prophetic telescoping. You got to think about it. If you're the prophet looking at these two peaks, you might not see the time gap between the two mountain peaks. From your perspective, you see the closer mountain and you see the farther mountain, and it almost looks like the larger mountain is overshadowing the smaller mountain. You might not even be aware that there are two fulfillments. You might only be aware of one of them. We aren't always given those details. But what we can learn now, since a lot of prophecy has gone by, right? Since we're living in the end times and we're drawing the age of humanity to a close, I firmly believe that, then using history and looking backwards and using the Bible as our primary guide, and using history to verify, using history to verify the Bible, not using the Bible to verify history. Well, use them both together, but the Bible's the final word. But history has come along now and demonstrated that there are a lot of prophecies that there was this gap between first fulfillment or the near fulfillment or the now fulfillment and the far. So that's one of the primary things I want you to walk away with. Near and far, you'll have a prophecy that has kind of a partial near or a now fulfillment, and then there's a time gap, and then there'll be a far fulfillment. And often that's all there is, just those two. We don't find prophecies that are recycled over and over and over and over again, like kind of idealistic fashion. Although there are themes that are repeated over and over in Scripture, concepts, obedience, disobedience, punishment, blessing, anointed people who come on the scene and bring God's people into kind of a revival and restoration, and then the people fall out of favor with God because they play the harlot and they fall into disobedience and God punishes them, but then he spares a remnant and restores them. And so we find these kind of roller coaster ride themes that are repeated throughout the Bible. Persecution comes and goes, tribulation comes and goes, salvation on a natural level comes and goes. But there are timeless themes also found in the Bible as well, right? The atonement picture of Messiah, the forgiveness that God offers through the Messiah's blood, the death of Messiah on the cross. Obviously, there are themes that take place in the Bible that for which there's one event that primarily captures that theme, and it's not to be repeated over and over again. So that's basically how Bible prophecy works. So having said that, as we begin to look at this part of Daniel chapter 9, there are these views of end-time prophecy that I have to remind you of over and over again, because as you study Bible prophecy, it becomes imperative that you identify which perspective that makes the most sense to you as you're reading through commentaries. So when you listen to my commentary, you might think, I don't agree with you, Ariel. I disagree with you strongly. Why would you think that this prophecy means that? And perhaps part of the disagreement is because I'm coming from a different hermeneutic perspective than you. And so it's helpful to first identify from what hermeneutic perspective you identify with, so that when you read other people's prophecy, other people's commentaries, you can appreciate why you might have a disagreement with them, or the reverse is true. You might read a commentary and go, wow, this guy hit it right on the nose. I agree with him. Why can't everybody else see this? Well, the reason why everybody else can't see this is because we have different camps of hermeneutic, kind of a scriptural bias, the way we view the Bible and interpret it. So I've got 3 pulled up on the screen. There's really a 4th one that we've talked about, right? Preterism, futurism, idealism, and historicism. We're talking about discovering or interpreting prophecy. But for now, let's just focus on 3 of the main ones that impact us the most, because they kind of represent polar opposites almost when it comes to interpreting prophecy. We've got on the left side of your screen the preterist view of the book of Revelation. And then on the right side of the screen, we've got the futurist view. And hovering above both of them is this long arrow running back and forth called the historicist. And basically the way it works is this. When we're talking about end-time prophecy, specifically the book of Revelation, which includes the book of Daniel that we're going to be looking at tonight, when it comes to preterism and preterists, most preterists hold to views that most of the books of the Bible that deal with end-time prophecy have already been fulfilled at the first coming of Messiah. 70 AD, the Jewish wars from 67 to 73, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and plowing under and the kicking out of the Jews in the 160s, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and things like that. So all of those events of the first century describe the primary preterist view. Remember, preterism comes in 2 flavors: full preterism or hyper preterism, where everything basically is fulfilled at 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem and all that, in other words, 2,000 years ago, meaning the book of Revelation doesn't contain anything that's really going to be coming in the future. And then there's partial preterism, which still carries a lot of the baggage, I call it, of full preterism, but it allows for some events to still be future. One of these days I'll do a whole excursus on just preterism, partial versus full, but I'm not going to do that tonight. Germane to our study, however, is that preterism it stands in more or less a polar opposite opinion of the futurist view. In case you're wondering what those little orange symbols are on your screen, they represent in this order from left to right, the seals of the book of Revelation, the trumpets or shofars of the book of Revelation, and the bowls of the Revelation. That's what those little symbols are. The first one on the left is a seal, like a little badge. The one in the middle under historicist is a shofar, a ram's horn, or a trumpet. And the one on the far right is a bowl, like you eat cereal out of. Okay, so futurist view takes the view of that much of the book of Revelation describes the second coming of Messiah and the destructions surrounding Jerusalem and the tribulations and the coming of Antichrist and all these things is still future, even future from our day. So meaning when Daniel wrote what we're going to read about tonight, and when John wrote what we're going to read about in the book of Revelation, a lot of that was based on history, but it's also a forward-looking prophecy. It hasn't all come to happen yet. Particularly this slice of history known as the 70th week of Daniel, which we're going to talk about tonight. So futurists and preterists are on two opposite sides of the table when it comes to this discussion of what is end-time prophecy, particularly Daniel's 70th week that we're going to be talking about tonight. And then sitting on top of all that is the historicist view that says, well, we don't have to really be so harsh and say that everything's preterist or futurist. Really, the Bible is not really trying to say that any of the time is important. It's really just about these concepts, kind of idealist historicist, and this idea that, historically speaking, many things have come and gone and impacted Israel and the church, and they're going to continue to do so until the end of time runs out. And so we don't have to really quake in fear with something that's coming down the road, but at the same time, we need to continue reading the Bible and studying it and realizing that there are ideals, that there are history lessons for us. And so the historicist view just kind of sees this long, drawn-out cosmic drama or battle between light and darkness that's kind of been impacting Israel and the church for a long, long time. It's just going to keep going that way until God puts an end to all of it. So we don't have to smash everything into either the first century like the preterists, and we don't have to smash everything into the last 7 years of the tribulation like the futurists. Instead, just stretch everything out over the last, say, 3,500 years of history between Israel and the church, and that's the best view. That's the historicist view. All right, so that's why when you're reading through people's commentaries and you're looking at their kind of their bottom lines, you're like, okay, yeah, I agree with that, or no, I think I don't agree with that. That's probably wise because you hold one of these viewpoints. So let's see, did I miss anything there? No, preterist, futurist, historicist. All right, okay. Last few weeks, we've been reading through Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. We talked about beasts, we talked about animals, we talked about metals and a statue. Here's the overview to prep us for Daniel chapter 9, because it's really the same picture, the same story, the same message from God given to Daniel. It's just a different version of it. In Daniel chapter 2, we had 4 metals. Look at the graphic on the screen here. In Daniel chapter 2, we had 4 metals. The symbols of the metals were going from top to bottom, from the head of the statue down to the feet. We had the gold, silver, the bronze, the iron, and then the iron and the clay. And the representatives were that the gold was Babylon, which represents, going from left to right, which represented the, I'm sorry, let me stop there. The gold was Babylon, the silver was Medo-Persia, the bronze was Greece, and the iron was Rome, and the iron and clay were the 10 kingdoms that we should identify as either a revival of the Roman Empire or kind of the identified with Rome in some way, but maybe not necessarily Rome, right? There's some, that's where the prophetic telescoping comes into play between the near aspect of Rome, near to Daniel's day and near to John, who wrote the book of Revelation, existing in John's day. But at the same time, some of the details in the prophecy are clearly future facing or far prophecy, right? The smaller mountain peak and the larger mountain peak behind it. Iron and clay would be the larger mountain peak, and the iron itself would be the smaller mountain peak. So Rome would be the smaller, near part of the prophecy, and the revived Rome, or the 10 kingdoms of the New World Order that's going to hit the scene that I believe is in the future, that would be the far the far peak, the larger one that looms behind with this gap in the middle. Moving from left to right in this little chart, when we went from Daniel chapter 2 to Daniel chapter 7 and going from the metals to the beasts, the symbol changed, but the message was the same. The gold, which represented Babylon, is now represented by a beast known as lion, which is still Babylon. The silver, which represented Medo-Persia, was now represented by a bear, which was, again, Medo-Persia in Daniel 7. The bronze of Daniel 2, which was Greece, became a leopard in Daniel chapter 7, and the iron of Daniel 2, which was Rome, became the fourth beast in Daniel chapter 7. And then the iron and clay of the statue, which were the 10 kingdoms in Daniel 2, turns into the 10 horns of Daniel chapter 7, which are the 10 kingdoms. So they're all the same. Now, when we get to Daniel 9, which we're going to look at tonight, we're not going to find any metals. We're not going to find any beasts per se. What we will find now are time frames given, weeks of years and decrees and details concerning the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And then we will, as we get farther into the prophecy of those 4 short verses, verse 26 and 27, we start then beginning to zero in on some of the key players, the prince who's to come, the anointed one, the person who makes a covenant with the many, etc., etc. So that's where we're going with tonight's study. Let me flash some pictures for you. Again, this was the image of Daniel chapter 2 that I was talking about a moment ago that we looked at. But as we're going to be turning to the Daniel 70 weeks, we now begin to look at some different graphics. You can go on the internet and search these pictures out. Daniel's 70 weeks or 70 weeks of Daniel or something to that effect. And you'll end up with some timelines that resemble what we're looking at here. I'm going to, again, try to keep this as simple as possible. I know there are going to be those Bible teachers who are going to try and pick apart this part of Daniel's prophecy to try and zero in on when does the timing start? When does it come to an end? Who are the key players?